The Whittaker family seemed, from the outside, like a quintessential example of suburban bliss. Edward Whittaker, a steadfast accountant with a warm smile, was the kind of man who remembered neighbors' birthdays and coached his daughter's little league games. His wife, Vanessa, had an ethereal presence, a striking woman with a laugh that could fill a room and a penchant for hosting dinner parties that became the talk of the neighborhood. Yet, within the walls of their stately home, secrets thrived like weeds in a well-tended garden. The events that would shatter their carefully curated lives began in the unlikeliest of moments, hidden beneath the guise of family unity. It was Edward's father, Charles, whose illness had brought the family closer, or so it seemed. Diagnosed with a degenerative condition, the patriarch moved into the Whittakers' home, where he required near-constant care. Vanessa had insisted on taking charge of the arrangements, her devotion earning her admiration from Edward and their circle of friends. But admiration can sometimes mask motives far darker than devotion. Edward's younger brother, Henry, had always been the family's black sheep. A charmer with a grin that could disarm even the most skeptical soul, he had drifted through life without settling. When Charles's health began to deteriorate, Henry's sporadic visits became more frequent, a fact that Edward initially viewed as a sign of his brother's newfound responsibility. The brothers couldn't have been more different. Edward was a man of routine and reliability, while Henry was all impulsiveness and flair. Edward had built his life on hard work and steady love, while Henry had skated by on charm and recklessness. But blood tied them together, and Edward welcomed his brother's presence in their father's twilight years. It was during one of these visits that Edward first noticed something he couldn't quite name. It was in the way Vanessa laughed at Henry's jokes, a little too freely, or how her hand lingered on his arm for a beat too long. At first, Edward dismissed it as the product of his own fatigue. Caregiving was a weight that left little room for reasoned thought. But then, the oddities began to stack up. One night, Edward awoke to find the house eerily quiet. Charles's room was empty, as was the kitchen, where he expected to find Vanessa preparing one of her midnight snacks. As he made his way through the dimly lit hallway, muffled voices caught his attention. Peering into the den, he saw them, Vanessa and Henry, seated close together, their heads bent in an intense conversation. The moment was fleeting, but the image of their closeness burned into Edward's mind. He didn't confront them. Instead, Edward did what he always did, rationalized. He convinced himself that his wife and brother were simply leaning on one another in a time of shared grief. After all, Henry had never been known for tact, and Vanessa's warmth could easily be mistaken for something it wasn't. He resolved to let it go. But suspicion is a seed, and once planted, it begins to grow. The following months brought no relief. Vanessa became more distant, her laughter more forced. Henry, too, seemed evasive, his visits no longer accompanied by the easy camaraderie they once shared. And then there were the whispers, hushed conversations that stopped abruptly when Edward entered a room, sidelong glances exchanged when they thought he wasn't looking. Edward began to question everything. Could his wife, the woman who had stood by him through years of financial strain and personal doubt, really betray him? Could his brother, the man who had shared his childhood, truly be capable of such treachery? The weight of his doubts grew heavier with each passing day. The final straw came one evening when Vanessa announced, with trembling hands and a voice filled with emotion, that she was pregnant. It should have been a moment of unbridled joy, after years of trying, a miracle. Yet, as Edward held her close, the timing struck a discordant note. Months before, after careful deliberation, Edward had undergone a vasectomy. He hadn't told Vanessa, convinced they had made peace with the idea of being a family of three. And now, as she wept with happiness, he could feel the walls of his world beginning to close in. Edward sat in the quiet of his office, staring blankly at the ledger in front of him. Numbers swam across the page, meaningless in the wake of the bombshell Vanessa had dropped the night before. A baby. A miracle, she called it. Her voice had been filled with such genuine joy, her hands trembling as she reached for his. He had nodded, held her, said all the right things. But inside, his heart was a storm, pounding with questions too dangerous to voice. The vasectomy had been a decision they'd made together, or so he thought. Vanessa had been the one to suggest it, citing their busy lives and the demands of caring for Charles. At the time, it seemed a mutual understanding, a practical choice for a practical couple. Now, as the revelation of her pregnancy loomed over him, Edward couldn't escape the feeling that he had been played. He traced back over the past few months, replaying every interaction, every word, searching for the moment when things had shifted. Vanessa had always been attentive, but lately, her affection had felt rehearsed. And Henry, what had once been casual brotherly banter now felt forced, strained. It was as though both of them were actors in a play he hadn't been invited to watch. The following evening, Edward resolved to observe rather than confront. He had always been a man who thrived on facts, and if there was one thing he knew about betrayal, it was that assumptions were dangerous. When Vanessa announced she was going to a late-night prenatal yoga class, Edward nodded as though it were the most natural thing in the world. "You should take it easy, though," he said, noting the way her hand tightened around the doorknob. "You've been pushing yourself a lot lately." Her laugh was light, but her eyes darted away. "I'm fine, Ed. The doctor said light exercise is good for the baby." He smiled. "Of course. Be safe." She left without another word, and Edward waited precisely 10 minutes before grabbing his keys. If there was nothing to find, then he would feel foolish, but relieved. If there was something, well, he needed to know. Parking a few blocks away, Edward sat in his car outside the yoga studio, watching women with yoga mats filter inside. Vanessa wasn't among them. He checked the clock. 15 minutes passed. Then 30. Edward's heart sank as he watched a figure emerge from a side street, a figure he knew all too well. Henry. His brother was unmistakable, his confident stride in the leather jacket that Vanessa had once described as hot in an outlaw kind of way. Edward's stomach churned as Henry glanced over his shoulder before slipping into the passenger seat of a dark sedan. The car drove off, Vanessa at the wheel. Edward followed at a safe distance, his mind racing as the car wound through the quiet streets of their town. They stopped outside a small house on the edge of town, a rental, by the looks of it. Henry stepped out first, then leaned into the driver's side window, sharing a laugh with Vanessa before heading inside. Vanessa lingered for a moment, checking her reflection in the rearview mirror, before following him through the door. The image of them disappearing together felt like a knife twisting in Edward's chest. It wasn't just the betrayal, it was the casualness of it, the ease with which they had lied to him. His hands trembled on the steering wheel as he sat in stunned silence, trying to decide what to do. A part of him wanted to burst through that door, to demand answers, to confront them with their treachery. But another part of him, colder and more calculating, knew he needed proof, something irrefutable. In the weeks that followed, Edward became a shadow in his own life, his every moment consumed by the need to uncover the truth. He hired a private investigator, a discreet older man named Mark, who specialized in cases like his. Mark was thorough, providing Edward with a stream of evidence, photos of clandestine meetings, text messages exchanged late at night, and, most damning of all, a detailed timeline of the affair. The documents Mark handed him one evening painted a picture more horrifying than anything Edward had imagined. The affair hadn't been a fleeting lapse in judgment, it had been going on for over a year, beginning shortly after Charles moved in. Their father's illness had provided the perfect cover for Henry's increased presence in the house, and Vanessa had capitalized on Edward's trust. But the most gut-wrenching detail came in the form of a single line in a text exchange between Vanessa and Henry, dated 2 weeks before the pregnancy announcement. "Don't worry," Vanessa had written. "Edward will never know. He'll believe the baby is his." Edward stared at the words until they blurred. The betrayal was complete, his wife, his brother, and now a child who wasn't his. It was as though they had conspired to rewrite his entire life. The night Edward received the evidence, he didn't go home. Instead, he drove aimlessly through the streets of their quiet town, his thoughts a chaotic swirl. The weight of betrayal pressed down on him, each revelation another blow to his already fragile trust in the world. The faces of Vanessa and Henry haunted him, their laughter and stolen glances replaying in his mind like a cruel loop. By the time he pulled into a deserted park, the sun had dipped below the horizon, casting the world in shades of gray. Edward sat on a weathered bench, clutching the folder of evidence Mark had given him. It felt heavier than it should have, as though it contained not just paper but the ruins of his life. He opened the folder again, flipping through the photographs and transcripts. There was a text exchange between Vanessa and Henry that caught his eye, dated the night of one of Charles's worst health crises. "Vanessa, can you come over? I don't think I can handle this alone." Henry, "Of course. Anything for you." Vanessa, I don't know what I'd do without you. The words were innocuous on the surface, but Edward knew now what they really meant. Henry hadn't just been supporting Vanessa as a brother-in-law, he had been stepping into Edward's role as husband, partner, confidant. As he stared at the damning evidence, anger began to replace the numbness that had gripped him since he'd left the PI's office. It wasn't a fiery, uncontrolled rage, it was cold, precise, and terrifyingly focused. If they thought he was naive, if they believed they could manipulate him and rewrite the story of his life without consequence, they were wrong. He would expose them, not just to each other but to the world. And he would do it on his terms. The next morning, Edward returned home to find Vanessa already in the kitchen, humming softly as she prepared breakfast. She looked up and smiled as he entered, her face a picture of calm. It struck him how convincing she was, how effortlessly she wore the mask of a loving wife. "Morning, Hon," she said, placing a steaming cup of coffee on the counter for him. "You were out late last night. Everything okay?" "Just work," Edward replied, his voice carefully neutral. He sipped his coffee, the bitterness mirroring the storm inside him. Vanessa didn't seem to notice his tone. "I was thinking we could have a little celebration tonight. It's been a while since we had a proper date night, and I want to do something special. For the baby." Her hand drifted to her stomach, and Edward felt a pang of both sorrow and anger. "That sounds great," he said, forcing a smile. "I'll make reservations." Vanessa beamed, the picture of contentment. Edward excused himself and went to his office, closing the door behind him. His phone buzzed, a message from Mark. "The paternity test will be ready by the end of the week." Edward stared at the screen, the weight of those words pressing on him. He had submitted Vanessa's prenatal test results, samples he had quietly taken from the lab during one of her appointments, alongside his own DNA. If there was any doubt about the child's parentage, it would soon be erased. The evening came quickly, and Edward found himself sitting across from Vanessa at an upscale restaurant downtown. The candlelight reflected in her eyes as she spoke animatedly about baby names and nursery colors, her excitement a stark contrast to the turmoil Edward felt. Halfway through the meal, she reached across the table and placed her hand over his. "I know it's been a tough year, Ed. With your dad's illness, and now this pregnancy, it's a lot. But I want you to know I'm here for you. I love you." The words twisted in Edward's chest, their weight magnified by what he knew. He swallowed hard, nodding. "I love you too, Vanessa." But the words felt hollow. As they finished their meal, Vanessa excused herself to use the restroom. Edward seized the opportunity, discreetly pulling out his phone to check the GPS tracker he had installed on her car. It was a measure he'd hesitated to take, but now, it seemed like the only way to stay ahead of her. The screen confirmed his suspicions, her visits to the rental house were frequent and perfectly timed with her so-called prenatal classes. When Vanessa returned, Edward suggested they take a drive through their old neighborhood, a place they used to visit often before life became so complicated. She agreed, and they spent the next hour winding through the streets, reminiscing. It almost felt normal, a glimpse of the life they'd once shared. But as they returned home, Edward's mind was already spinning with plans. He wouldn't confront her yet, not until he had the paternity results. Until then, he would gather more evidence, ensure there was no room for denial or manipulation. 2 days later, the results came in. Edward sat in his car outside the lab, the envelope heavy in his hands. He opened it with trembling fingers, scanning the document until his eyes landed on the conclusion. Probability of paternity, 0%. The air seemed to leave the car in a rush, the confirmation both expected and devastating. The baby wasn't his. It was Henry's. Edward's grip on the paper tightened as he fought the surge of emotions threatening to overwhelm him. Pain, anger, humiliation, they all vied for control. But beneath it all was a cold determination. This wasn't just betrayal, it was theft, of trust, of love, of a future he had spent years building. And now, they would pay. Edward walked into the house that evening with a sense of purpose, the envelope containing the paternity results tucked into his coat pocket like a weapon. The house was quiet except for the faint strains of music drifting from the kitchen, where Vanessa stood at the stove. She looked up as he entered, her face lighting up with a smile that now felt like a mockery. "Hey, honey. You're home early," she said, setting down a wooden spoon. I thought we could talk, Edward replied, his voice steady, his expression unreadable. I realized we haven't really had a chance to sit down and just connect. Vanessa's smile faltered for a fraction of a second before she recovered. That's a great idea. Let me finish up dinner, and we can sit down in the living room. No rush, Edward said, shrugging off his coat. He hung it deliberately on the back of a chair, ensuring the pocket with the envelope was within reach. I'll grab us some wine. As he poured 2 glasses, his mind raced through the plan he had spent the past few days perfecting. He couldn't confront Vanessa without addressing Henry. The two of them were so tangled in their lies that any one-sided confrontation would inevitably lead to denial and manipulation. No, they needed to face him together. The opportunity came the next evening when Henry arrived for another one of his family dinners. Edward greeted his brother warmly, masking the bitterness that churned inside him. Vanessa flitted about the kitchen, chatting with Henry as though nothing was amiss. Edward noted the subtle looks they exchanged, the unspoken familiarity between them. Dinner passed in strained pleasantries, with Edward steering the conversation toward family memories, the kind that made Vanessa and Henry visibly uncomfortable. He watched them squirm, delighting in their discomfort, though his face betrayed nothing. After the meal, Edward cleared his throat. There's something I want to discuss with both of you, he said, his tone casual but firm. It's been on my mind for a while. Vanessa's smile faltered. Of course. What is it? Let's sit in the living room, Edward suggested, gesturing toward the sofas. He retrieved the envelope from his coat, keeping it hidden for now, and followed them into the room. The 3 of them sat in a triangle, Edward facing both Vanessa and Henry. For a moment, the room was filled with the ticking of the clock on the mantel. You know, Edward began, leaning back in his chair, this past year has been enlightening. Vanessa's eyes darted to Henry before returning to Edward. What do you mean? She asked, her voice betraying a hint of nervousness. Edward ignored her question, instead pulling the envelope from his pocket and placing it on the coffee table. I had some questions recently, he continued, about trust, loyalty, family. Henry shifted in his seat, a shadow of unease crossing his face. Come on, Ed, what's this about? Edward smiled coldly. It's about the baby. And the truth. The room fell silent. Vanessa's face paled, her hands gripping the edge of the sofa as though bracing for impact. Henry's gaze flicked to the envelope. I had a paternity test done, Edward said, his voice like ice. He tapped the envelope. And it turns out, the baby isn't mine. Vanessa gasped, her face a mix of shock and panic. How could you? Why would you do that without telling me? Edward leaned forward, his eyes piercing hers. Because I knew you'd lie. Just like you've been lying for the past year. Henry's mouth opened, but no sound came out. The confident charm he usually exuded was gone, replaced by an expression of naked fear. Save it, Henry, Edward snapped, his voice sharp enough to make his brother flinch. I know. I know everything. Vanessa tried to speak, but Edward cut her off with a raised hand. Spare me the denials. I have texts, photos, videos of you sneaking off to that rental house. And now, I have this, he said, pointing to the envelope. Proof that you've both been making a fool of me. Vanessa's composure crumbled. Tears streamed down her face as she reached for him. Edward, please, it wasn't supposed to be like this. I didn't mean to hurt you. Hurt me? Edward's laugh was bitter, his voice rising. You didn't just hurt me, Vanessa. You shattered everything we built together. And you, he turned to Henry, his voice dripping with venom, you betrayed your own brother. How do you even justify that to yourself? Henry's face reddened. I didn't mean for this to happen, Ed. It just did. Just did. Edward's voice was deadly calm now. That's your excuse. You just happened to sleep with my wife. You just happened to father a child with her. Vanessa sobbed, her words barely coherent. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. We made a mistake, but the baby doesn't have to change things. We can still. Edward slammed his hand on the table, making both of them jump. Don't you dare talk about fixing this. You've both made your choices, and now you'll live with the consequences. He stood, pacing the room as the weight of the moment settled on all of them. Here's what's going to happen, he said, his voice steely. I'm filing for divorce. I'll make sure the court sees every piece of evidence I've gathered. As for you, Henry, don't bother calling me. Don't bother coming to Dad's funeral when the time comes. As far as I'm concerned, you're no longer my brother. Vanessa wailed, begging Edward to reconsider, but her words fell on deaf ears. Henry sat in stunned silence, his usual bravado shattered. Edward walked to the door, grabbing his coat. Before leaving, he turned back to them, his face a mask of controlled fury. You think you've won, that you can just rewrite my life. But the thing about the truth is, it always comes out. And when it does, it destroys everything in its path. The days that followed were a whirlwind of legal consultations, evidence submissions, and moments of quiet rage. Edward had been a man of order and routine, but now he moved with the precision of a surgeon, cutting away the diseased parts of his life. Vanessa had tried to reach him repeatedly, her texts and calls ranging from tearful pleas to desperate declarations of love. Henry, in contrast, had vanished entirely. Perhaps he was too ashamed to face Edward, or perhaps he was waiting for the fallout to settle. Either way, their silence only fueled Edward's resolve. By the end of the week, the divorce papers were filed, and the news of the scandal had begun to trickle through their tight-knit community. Edward hadn't meant for it to happen so quickly, but secrets as explosive as these had a way of leaking, especially when neighbors started noticing Vanessa moving back to her parents' home, her pregnancy now impossible to hide. The final confrontation came on a stormy evening, the rain lashing against the windows of Edward's now empty home. He sat in the living room, nursing a glass of whiskey, the folder of evidence sitting on the coffee table in front of him like a tombstone marking the death of his marriage. The doorbell rang, the sound sharp against the howling wind. Edward didn't need to check the peephole to know who it was. He opened the door to find Vanessa standing there, drenched from the rain, her face streaked with tears. "Please," she whispered, clutching her coat around her swollen belly. "I need to talk to you." Edward stepped aside without a word, letting her in. She hovered in the entryway, dripping water onto the floor, looking smaller and more fragile than he had ever seen her. "I don't know where else to go," she said, her voice trembling. "My parents, they don't understand. They think I'm a monster." Edward regarded her coldly. "And are they wrong?" Her lip quivered, but she didn't respond. Instead, she sank into the chair nearest the fire, her hands resting protectively on her stomach. "I made mistakes," she began. "Terrible mistakes. But I never stopped loving you, Edward." He scoffed, the sound harsh and bitter. "Love? You call what you did love?" "I was lonely," she said, her voice breaking. "You were so consumed with work, with taking care of your father. I felt invisible, Edward. And Henry, he was there when I needed someone." Edward's fists clenched at his sides. "So that's your justification? I was too busy taking care of our family, so you decided to sleep with my brother?" Tears spilled down her cheeks. "I'm not excusing it. I know I've ruined everything, but this baby, it doesn't have to be part of the mess we made." Edward stared at her, his anger momentarily giving way to something else, pity, perhaps, or exhaustion. "That child is Henry's," he said flatly. "And nothing you say will change that." Vanessa's face crumpled, her sobs filling the room. "I'm scared," she whispered. "I don't know how to do this alone." Edward's voice softened, though it held no warmth. "You should have thought about that before you betrayed me." For a long moment, the only sounds were the crackle of the fire and the rhythmic patter of rain. Then Vanessa looked up, her eyes red and swollen. "What do you want me to do?" Edward's expression hardened again. "I want you to leave. I want you to raise the child with the man you chose over me. And I want you to stay out of my life." 3 months later, Edward stood at his father's graveside, the winter wind biting at his face. The funeral was small, attended only by close friends and family. Henry had stayed true to his word and hadn't shown up, a fact that brought Edward a cold sense of satisfaction. As the ceremony concluded, Edward lingered, watching as the casket was lowered into the ground. He felt the weight of grief, not just for his father, but for everything he had lost, the life he had built, the family he thought he knew. But as he stood there, he realized something else. Grief wasn't just about loss, it was about letting go. And as painful as it was, he knew he had to let go of the anger, the betrayal, the resentment. Holding on to it would only destroy him further. That evening, back in his now quieter, simpler home, Edward sat by the fire, a glass of whiskey in his hand. The folder of evidence sat in the flames, its contents curling and blackening as the fire consumed them. He watched until the last page disintegrated into ash, the weight of its secrets lifting from his shoulders. For the first time in months, Edward felt something close to peace. His life had been torn apart, but in the ruins, he saw the chance to rebuild, not the life he had lost, but something new, something stronger. 6 months later, Edward found himself in a new city, a new job, and a new home. The scars of the past were still there, but they no longer defined him. He had learned to smile again, to laugh, to trust, slowly, but surely. And as he sat on his balcony one evening, watching the sun dip below the horizon, he felt something he hadn't in a long time: hope. The past would always be a part of him, but it no longer controlled him. Edward Whittaker was moving forward, one step at a time. And for the first time, he wasn't looking back. What would you do if betrayed by those closest to you? Could Edward's path of resilience inspire forgiveness or closure? Share your thoughts.